Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The UK's Home Secretary says intelligence agencies have been summoned to tackle the rising terror threat from far-right extremists. Statistics show referrals to Britain's counter-terror program based on right-wing plots have increased by 36% in a year. Additionally, more Caucasians have been arrested on suspicion of terror offences than Asians. The role of politicians and the media have also been highlighted in bringing this growing threat into the limelight. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Ms. Pamela Williamson, who is an esteemed analyst. She's part of an international network of subject matter experts and analysts. She has a Master of Conflict and Terrorism. She is joining us now from Auckland in New Zealand. Pamela, thanks for joining us. We're also joined by Dr Simon Hale-Ross, who is a researcher of counterterrorism. He's senior lecturer in law and policing in the Department of Law and Criminology at Edge Hill University. He's joining us now from Manchester in the UK. Simon, we appreciate you joining us as well. Pamela, I'm going to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the growing threat of far-right extremism? You're obviously speaking from New Zealand, so it seems appropriate to put this to you first, considering what's happened there recently.
Well, I think for many people, it's come out of left field. I've been watching it and writing about it for at least a couple of years. I've been particularly aware of what's been happening in the US, but I've noticed it's been spreading its tentacles across Europe, Eastern Europe, and the UK. And never in my wildest dreams would I have expected it to have come to New Zealand.
And do you think, Pamela, that that is the fault of intelligence agencies, such as those possibly in New Zealand, that they simply didn't even look where they should have been looking?
Well, there is a review underway, and I hesitate to apportion blame at this point. But what I do know is that the UK has been aware of it in its contest counter-terrorism program. Obviously, there was a number of attacks in quite a close period of time, particularly from when the killing of the UK parliamentarian and several attacks, Manchester, London Bridge, and of course the retaliatory attacks, really a form of what people are calling reciprocal radicalisation, but I call it, they're almost tit-for-tat retaliatory attacks, and the Finbury Park Mosque killing is one that came subsequent to those earlier ones. So the MI5, which is leading the UK counter-terrorism response at the moment, and that's really just been announced at the end of March. The head of MI5 and the head of the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police announced jointly that JTAC, which is the Joint Terrorism Analysts Centre, is now going to prioritise far right-wing terrorism as much as Islamist terrorism.
And Pamela, if I may, I'm going to interrupt you just because I apologize for interrupting you, but in fact put that point you just made there about timing of all of this. Simon, I'm wondering what you make of that. Why now? Why wasn't far-right extremism as big an issue for these intelligence agencies, for the Home Secretary, for the government before? It's not like this is a new phenomenon, is it?
No, it's not new at all. I mean, just as Pamela has said, I've been following this for a number of years now. The growth in right wing has been steady. Why now and why not last year? I suppose only the Home Secretary can actually answer that. MI5 through JTAC, as they head JTAC, and Pamela really did hit the nail on the head with that. They focus on the terrorist threat rather than extremism. And what the Home Secretary has now suggested is that under the JTAC, extremism is now going to be watched just as closely as terrorist threats that are posed. That's the biggest change that we've seen. And I think that is simply because of the latest reports we've had through the Prevent programme, the report from April 2017 to March 2018. My biggest concern at this point actually is the age range. the highest number of prevent referrals and the highest number of those who are then discussed at a channel panel and then that receive support are overwhelmingly under the age of 15 and between the ages of 15 to 20. Now that might be indicative of where the referrals are coming from. We have 32% of the referrals coming from policing agencies, and we have 33% coming from the educational sector. Now that's spiked since 2015, since the passing of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015.
Okay, so Simon, I'm wondering, Pamela mentioned something earlier, and I'm going to ask her about that as well, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Is this tit for tat sort of extremism? Because I know that's been mentioned in a number of places where there has been discussions about this topic. Is far-right terror necessarily connected to crimes that Muslims may have carried out or other minorities may have carried out, or is this something separate from that? Is this more to do with, I don't know, economic issues, for example? Many people say that Brexit, for example, occurred because a large section of the population felt that they were under economic pressure and they blamed the EU for that, for example. What are your thoughts on that, Simon?
They're interlinked. I don't think you can just call it tit for tat, and I don't think Pamela did that. She said there was an element of tit for tat, and there is.
Of course, I didn't want to put words in her mouth. That's why I wanted to get her to clarify, of course. Yep, go ahead, though, Simon.
Yeah, perhaps you can do that in a moment. But I think it's not as simple as saying it's tit for tat.
Okay.
We have a right-wing populist movement that is spreading across the globe. It's been spreading across the European Union since 2011, 2012. The latest, if you want to say, right-wing party has just come to power in Italy. It's growing, and the trouble is, I'm often reminded of the Time Warp song, forgive me for this, from the Rocky Horror Show. We jump to the left and a step to the right. We have in the United Kingdom a Corbyn-led Labour government which has taken a jump to the left.
Yeah.
We now have a backbench-led Conservative Party, which is leading Brexit, which is extraordinarily divisive in the United Kingdom, and they've taken a step to the right. So we have quite a rather large hole in the centre at the moment.
Okay, so I know Pamela wants to come in. Pamela, I didn't mean to say the thought this was for tit for tat, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that narrative. What do you make of that?
Well, there are many factors, and when you're looking at the youth of some of these offenders, for example, just on Saturday, there was a young man who, and it's early days yet with him, but it's reported that he's mentally ill and that he has a substance abuse problem. And I know Darren Osborne of the Finbury Park Mosques was an alcoholic. So there are personal factors that are radicalising people. The Counter-Terrorism Project that I follow, it's an international project of former world leaders like former ambassadors who have put together a lot of research and timelines on terrorism around the world. And they're defining it in quite an interesting way. And I wouldn't mind an opportunity just to read that paragraph to you. They say it's hard-working European natives who are suffering economic and cultural losses due to immigrants and ethnic minorities who want to replace national, religious and cultural identities with foreign values. So it's a kind of anxiety, fear, paranoia, and one of the groups,
Pamela, if I may come in, I apologize for interrupting you, but I think it's important. What is your personal opinion? What is your expert opinion on that? Do you agree with that? Is that a legitimate concern?
Yes, I think it is. I think the economic circumstances of people are radicalising them, but I think that probably one of the primary things is social media. Okay. And the way nationalism and populist nationalist ideas are infecting communities.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought up social media there, Pamela, because I think that's an important, that's a whole other argument, but I want to, in fact, open up that argument, if I may, Simon, because, in fact, a lot of the academics, and I'm sure Pamela and even yourself, Simon, obviously understand the power of social media in such cases, in terrorism in general, but now with this far-right extremism as well. What role do you think that has played in all of this?
I think it's played a massive role. I mean, you've got to consider that back in 2015, the average age of the would-be terrorist leaving our shores to join the Islamic State was around 24. And people seem shocked that the ability that they have to use social media. But the 24, they've grown up with social media. They've grown up with smart devices that can use this. And I think that also may equate for the amount of under 20-year-olds that have been referred to the PREVENT program.
Okay, so Simon, if I may come in, I wanted to ask you one thing, and that specifically then being about when we're talking about the age here, because many people would say, and from the outside, and it's interesting, many people would say that it's actually the elder generation. And I'm talking about in the context of the UK, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, of course, but the image is that the elder generation in the UK is the one that is the most racist, or has the most racism within it. Again, not generalizing everybody, of course, but is that true? And why then would the youth be going backwards when it comes to the issue of race?
This is what I find most shocking, because we're generalizing here, of course, okay, but generalistically speaking, the older one gets, usually the further right the beliefs become. And that's across the globe. There's nothing new. Yeah. But here we are stepping back, and that's what I find concerning. And I'm wondering if this is as a direct consequence of social media and of perhaps the use of the darknet and the way the internet is moving within these darker realms.
Okay, time now for a very short break, but Pamela and Simon, please do stay with us. A new voice to this conversation as well. After the break, viewers, stay with us as well. We're going to continue this conversation. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in Scope. We're still joined by Pamela and Simon, and we're discussing, of course, the UK Home Secretary saying intelligence agencies there are being brought in to help tackle the far-right issue that is now growing in the United Kingdom. We're now also joined by Mr. Bjørn Ihler, who is a counter-terror expert. He's co-founder of the Khalifa Ihler Institute, and he's joining us now from Oslo in Norway. Bjørn, thank you for joining us as well here in Scope. Bjørn, I wonder what you make of the issue of mental health and the background, many times, of extremists. And we're talking specifically, of course, of far-right extremists in this specific case, be they alcoholics, be they coming from abusive backgrounds, or have fallen on tough economic times. When we're talking about far-right extremists, Bjørn, it seems, and a lot of Muslims bring this up, I know, this issue of double standards, then why is that same standard not then extended to any Muslim who carries out such criminal acts?
So I think when it comes to extremism and kind of Western Europe, we have had a tendency to try to externalize the issue as much as possible, to try to make it seem as far removed from our own kind of social policies as possible. And when it comes to Islamist extremism, that is fairly easy for Europeans to kind of externalize, say that this is something that belongs to a different part of the world, which we see a lot of narratives about. But when it comes to far-right extremism, it's far more difficult to kind of externalize it and say this is someone else's problem. So I think there's a tendency to kind of have the willingness to go look deeper for psychological factors when it comes to far-right extremists. And it thus kind of becomes a way of making excuses for our own failures as societies in preventing radicalization of individuals.
And so then, Bjørn, are you saying that terrorism cannot then be properly tackled unless you obviously talk about those root causes?
Well, we have to talk about the root causes, but we also have to realize that extremism is something that it belongs to all of us as a problem. It's something that has to be tackled at a societal level, from like an understanding of the root causes, but also an equality and understanding of those root causes, regardless of which ideology extremists are kind of affiliating with. But we also have to start looking at our local communities and what we can do to prevent radicalization of all kinds in our own neighborhoods, and really kind of take that responsibility.
Okay, and Pamela, what Bjørn there, do you think that's a realization that everyone around the world is now finally coming to, and again, I'm putting, I'm just putting this out there, that a lot of Muslims would say that there are double standards in the way, for example, discussions about mental health and or the background of whoever the terrorist may be. And of course, not justifying and or excusing any terrorist acts, but looking into the root causes of why this person, whoever he or she may be, is radicalized at whatever level. Why is that same standard not extended then, for example, to a Muslim or Islamist extremist?
Well, I think it probably is, if there is evidence of that. It's not a typical picture of white extremists to be mentally ill. Most of them, I would suggest, are perfectly sane individuals who have a vile ideology, and they have quite horrible white supremacist views, and many of them are not under 20 or under 24. These are adult men and women who have very ugly attitudes towards race and a sense of entitlement, a fear of this great replacement ideology that comes out of Generation Identity in France, that they have to push out anybody of a different skin colour in case their culture and their values and their skin colour is lost. I mean, it's as sort of visceral as that for a lot of them. But I don't think it's exculpatory. It's to do with understanding the drivers of radicalisation. And unless you do, and just in some cases, some people are mentally ill, but I wouldn't say that it's widespread.
Okay. Simon, I wonder what you make of that, because, as a lot of us say, terrorism really has no religion. But then if we were to look at, for example, news coverage of any terrorist attack or even plot, and I'm looking at this analysis right now that I just came across the statistics, 78% of news coverage, that would show Islamists or Muslims would call that attack and or plot terrorism. But far-right extremists would only be identified using that label in 27% of cases. And that's concerning, is it not? Because then again, it shows at some level denial, doesn't it, Simon?
Yes, but we're dealing with the media here. We're dealing with the mainstream media, and they tend to call it whatever they like, depending upon the attack and who the perpetrators are, as you just suggested. Legally, of course, they're dealt with on a level playing field. They're dealt with in the same way. If they've breached any of the terrorism legislation that we have in the UK, then they're dealt with under that terrorism legislation. If they murder another citizen, then they are convicted of murder. It's as simple as that. So they are dealt with the same way legally. It's just that the media tend to label it in a different way, and I find that rather disappointing, to be honest.
Okay, so Simon, what do you make then of the importance of addressing root causes? Because, for example, if I may just take the example of France for a quick second, many people would say that if there is extremism amongst the Muslims there, it may possibly be because of the ghettoization over there of Muslims in that society specifically. Do you think that governments are willing to really tackle those issues in order to stop radicalization of any sort?
I think they need to tackle anything that leads to this kind of radicalization. It's not as simple as to stamp out an ideology, and we've seen that with the Islamic State, we've seen that with Al Qaeda, and we've seen that with our own far right organisations in the United Kingdom, which have now been banned, such as National Action, which was banned in December of 2016. The United Kingdom is the first Western nation to actually outright ban a far right organisation, and since then we've banned another two. The root causes need to be addressed, but I come back to the time warp song. Because of the step to the right, far right extremists are now finding an easier platform, if you like, to move slightly into the centre ground, and that's one of the problems. Another issue, of course, is that we do have two distinct far right groups in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. We have those that are to the extreme far right, nationalist socialist ideology, neo-Nazis. Yeah. And then we have a far right who are generally anti-Islamic, anti-immigration and anti-EU. And it's this particular group which the debate over Brexit is fueling. It's just throwing more wood on the fire. And as we've seen now, it's been extended to October. It's the news today. Yeah. And again, it's this Brexit issue is so divisive. Mm. The step to the right of politics in the United States, across the EU and in the UK is really concerning.
Okay, so Bjørn, I know that you've been traveling around, and I believe you were in the UK for a bit as well. Tell us about your observations during these travels, and as an expert yourself, do you believe that, as Simon there correctly said, that it is genuinely just a right tilt that is happening in various parts of Europe and obviously in the US as well when it comes to Trump? And does that concern you, and what should be done to tackle it then?
So I think we can see it in Europe. I also think we could see it beyond Europe, and kind of a rise of populism, of right-wing ideologies seeping into parliament and into the mainstream politics, and that, of course, is creating kind of a shift in the national narratives and the media narratives, etc. And it's kind of taking steps that are ideologically closer to what we would call far-right extremism and far, neo-Nazis, essentially, in the past, and making it kind of seem legitimate in some way or another. So there's been this kind of legitimization of an extremist ideology. But then we also need to be careful to separate between those who are extremists in their words and those who are extremists in terms of direct violence. And I'm personally of the opinion that we should combat both. But of course, we also need to accept that there is diversity within the political spectrum.
Okay, so diversity within the political spectrum, that's a good point to make there, Pamela. What do you make of that? Do you think some politicians, or many politicians, realize now that because of, be it economic issues or whatever issues that may exist in any specific country's context, that they can ride on that wave to come into office, and they're not realizing, or maybe they are, about the consequences of their rhetoric, be it anti-immigrant, be it anti-Islam, or whatever?
I think it's very deliberate. I think that the playbook of various successful politicians such as Donald Trump has been picked up. I look at the president of the Brazilian situation at the moment. I look at places like Hungary, Poland even, Austria in particular, where you actually have Martin Sellner, who is the head of the identitarian movement. And bringing it back to New Zealand, the Christchurch shooter, it's been found that he's had connections with this group, with this individual. So what I've noticed is that the linkages internationally at quite a subterranean level on the deep, dark web, where intelligence agencies haven't been able to get at it. And the corporates like Facebook, and I'd like to bring them up now because they are not helpful. They are in fact obstructive. New Zealand's privacy commissioner and they're usually a very quiet and docile creature, but they are flamingly angry with Facebook at the moment for refusing to be of any assistance and being very disingenuous. Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg have made overtures to New Zealand, but he virtually a day later contradicted her. They were going to do something about Facebook Live, and then they weren't. And so this kind of, wanting to ride the storm, hope it blows over, I think is going on with these sorts of platforms.
Okay, so Simon, I'll give you the final word. In such a context, and Simon, where politicians would see it to their benefit to be ever more right-wing, can we then expect intelligence agencies, of which these leaders would be heading, or at some level at least, to be more even then in how they treat all kinds of extremists?
Well, speaking from the United Kingdom's perspective, we have separation of powers here. It's part of our uncodified but still written constitution.
Okay.
So the head of departments are appointed by government, which kind of goes against the grain. So I would hope that, given the ever-increasing accountability of our security services and of our counter-terrorism police, that influence would be diminished, but I'm not sure if it would be entirely diminished.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final point, but of course we appreciate all of your insights, your time, of course, and analysis. That was a very interesting conversation. Let me thank all of our guests here. We were joined there by Dr Simon Hale-Ross, who is a senior lecturer in law and policing in the Department of Law and Criminology at Edge Hill University. He was speaking to us from Manchester. We were also joined by Mr. Bjørn Ihler, who is a co-founder of the Khalifa Ihler Institute. He's an expert on countering and preventing violent extremism and terrorism. He was speaking to us from Oslo in Norway. And we were also joined by Ms. Pamela Williamson, who is part of an international network of subject matter experts and analysts. She has a Bachelor of Laws and a Master of Conflict and Terrorism, and she was speaking to us from Auckland in New Zealand. Now, viewers, as all of our guests there spoke about, there are aspects to this far-right terror threat which have seemingly been ignored by governments till now, with these terror plots that have come up for, at least as we know of, in the UK. It seems that the Home Secretary there, the Conservative Party, is finally acting, asking for intelligence agencies to be brought in to counter and tackle this ever-growing threat. But of course, it's not just a threat that exists in the UK, but exists throughout Europe, and as we recently saw in New Zealand as well, with those very large terror attacks that took place there. We'll wait and see how governments around the world react to this terror threat. Will they continue to label it as it should be labeled? And will media follow through? Will other politicians follow through around the world as well? That's very important as well. But that's all for this segment. I'll be back, though, after a short break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Thank you very much for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. Now, as General Khalifa Haftar seeks to advance on the Libyan capital, Tripoli, UNICEF has warned of the direct risk this escalation presents for over 500,000 children. It has also raised the alarm about the recruitment of children as soldiers. These clashes have forced the UN to also cancel a Libyan national conference, putting on hold chances of fruitful dialogue. To discuss that further, we now have our esteemed panelist, Dr. Matteo Capasso, who is a research associate at the European University Institute. He's joining us now from Florence in Italy. He's an expert of international relations and politics of the Middle East. We're also joined by Dr. Issam Laaroussi, who is professor of international law and senior research fellow at Trends for Research and Advisory. He is joining us now from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Issam and Matteo, thank you both for joining us. Issam, I'll start with you. What do you make of this UNICEF report about these children being under direct risk because of Haftar's actions?
Yes, I think this warning is very crucial and very sensitive in this very dangerous situation in Libya, degrading and very disastrous war in Libya. I think the law and international humanitarian law and over the past 40 years, and international law has developed better protect for children from military exploitation, which means that I will mention in 1977 the additional protocol to the 1949 Geneva Convention forbade the military recruitment and use for children under the age of 15, and also in 2002, and also in I think the last, it was in 2018. These measures and all the measures taken by the international law is to protect children, is to protect kids to be involved in the military operation, is to be recruited. At least some international experiences in the US and in UK, they put, I think it's prohibited to recruit children under 18, and or to be involved in war. It's prohibited to recruit them under 18, age of 18. I think the situation is very complicated in Libya, and for sure they have to gather all the parties, all the warriors parties, to make an end to this situation, to this crucial situation.
Okay.
I think in national dialogue and international intervention, it's obligatory now, just to make an end to this endless war started from 2011 till now. No sign of some achievement or some political and diplomatic achievement right now.
Okay, so I wanted to get Matteo in on this too. You know, obviously in any such situation, the concern is about the future generation, isn't it? And if these children are being recruited as soldiers, that doesn't bode well for the future of Libya, does it?
Thanks, Waqar, for having me here. Yes, I mean, I absolutely agree with you with the fact that if children and young people are basically so easily recruited by armed militias and brigades at this stage, actually, to be honest, this has been going on for a while now, then the future of Libya definitely looks dark. The problem is, for me, is that the UNICEF has, yes, launched this warning about the Libyan children, but UNICEF did so also when it came to Yemen. And this, in the case of Yemen, was not a warning, was actually a situation where children were living in it in a health condition. And the humanitarian community has done nothing in that sense. So I am afraid that, and I hate to say this, that this kind of calls are very much if they are humanitarian, yes, and they are very important and should be taken into consideration, but they are completely divorced from the political situation on the ground. The fact that we reached this stage is basically, due to what was, a humanitarian intervention, but basically was a regime change in 2011. And since then, all the international actors have been basically violating not just the humanitarian convention, but one of the most important UN security resolution, which was the provision of weapons to the different actors on the ground. And this is all connected. And yes, unfortunately, the situation does not seem to get, any better, unfortunately. Security and violence do remain one of the main socioeconomic opportunities provided to young people by the main rival factions, but also by the numerous militias that are present on the ground, allied to them.
That's a very good point, isn't it, Issam? Because, we need to talk about the external influences on Libya too, don't we, Issam? We can question the support for the UN government, the government that the UN recognizes and the international community recognizes. And then we need to talk about who supports Khalifa Haftar and why isn't the world letting Libyans decide for themselves, Issam?
I think Haftar plan was supported by many countries. We cannot tell all the countries. First of all, we can talk about U.S. We can also talk about the Russian intervention in the country. We can talk also about some Arab countries that are supporting Haftar in this North African country. And also the civil war is due to their. I think that their own geopolitical interest in Libya. First, geopolitical interest in Libya, and also there is some major objectives in Libya, and to say to take that they want that the LNE, which means Libyan National Army, takes control of Libya as a whole, including all the control oil reserves. I think in as much as ideological issues and interest in countering Libyan Islamist influence in the country, political landscape. I think these maneuvers or this support is coming from some specific countries, which mean a major international superpower and also regional powers that hardly supporting Haftar just to take into control all Libya into control, and also to control energy suppliers or energy wealth. So there is some we can talk about geopolitical and also economic variables that shape this and or influence these Arab countries and also the international countries to protect their agendas and to support these agendas, because this country is the most oil-rich country in Africa.
That's a very good point, isn't it, Matteo? Because there are many interests, obviously, when it comes to Libya. As Issam there mentioned, obviously, its oil reserves are one that any country would like to get its hands on, of course. But then secondly, obviously, it's also its strategic location. Why do you think, Matteo, then its strategic location close then to Europe isn't forcing Europe to do more to ensure stability in that country?
I think the question you're raising is fundamental in a way, because what we're seeing and what we've been seeing since 2011 is that basically Libya has become a playground for international powers, and particularly European powers. Whether it came with a high cost or a certain high cost to the population, what we can recognize to Gaddafi is that he always managed to maintain a certain of independence in the international arena. After 2011, basically, we're seeing a battle. From a very European perspective, what we can see is that, for example, Italy is now backing, as trying to be backing the UN-recognized government in Tripoli, whereas France has been silently and tacitly supporting General Haftar. This is very interesting. Why? Because, France was one of the first countries that basically jumped on the humanitarian intervention in 2011 to remove an authoritarian government, and now is backing a so-called, the mainstream narrative is that you have a renegade general who's trying to control Libya. Without talking about the support of, as Dr. Issam mentioned, of the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Whether the European countries are not doing enough or are not enforcing, no, they are actually working a lot in the country. The question is that they do not have a common vision, and this is precisely why, because there are economic interests. And I would tell you, at least that's the way I'm seeing things, that Libya is a mirror of what is happening in Europe. There is a need to expand financially for those countries, and Libya is basically one of the countries where this battle among European powers is taking place. The recent turn of Italy towards China is reflecting also of the division that France and Italy are actually, having at the international level, particularly for economic reasons. So what we're seeing is basically a battle there that we will see what's going to happen, because the ENI, the Italian national oil company, is all over in Libya, but France is trying to gain, to take more stakes in the country by supporting Haftar, and the whole discourse around reconstruction and what to do next with the country. So this is a situation.
Indeed. And Issam, I wanted to get your on that, because Issam, it does seem that when the international community got involved in Libya to ensure Gaddafi's ouster, that there wasn't a plan for what would happen afterwards. Why do you think that this keeps happening, that where there are international interventions, there is no plan for what happens after the leader is overthrown?
I think there is. We cannot tell one word about that, because the whole process after the collapse of Gaddafi's regime was the gathering. I think the international community gathered a lot of mistakes in that fight, because one of them is, I think, international resolution, UN resolution 1973, which I think specified that the UN and in empowering international powers to be involved and to protect under the NATO umbrella to protect civilians and to protect Libyan civilians. Otherwise, there is no political plan for serious political concessions, especially with the two parties struggling. I think Islamist party and the other secular party in Tobruk. I think those two parties struggling are warriors, and in addition to some militias, have I think very they have been involved in a very black let me say war, because it's very complicated. Many militias are inside. Many forces are struggling each other, and also in the regional and the international involvement in Libya, because they are protecting their agenda and they are protecting their interests. Finally, I can summarize that there is no action plan, a very clear action plan.
Okay.
It was I think they have their interests, they have their agenda, but they don't have a very clear vision how to ensure the political transition in Libya. There is no secure transition in Libya. After Gaddafi, what it was questionable. What was the plan? What was the political elite who is I think nominated a lot and supported by people.
Okay, let me bring up that point if you allow me, Issam, just for a moment, because I wanted to ask Matteo. There is a narrative now being spoken of, and I've seen this between the lines really in the research that I did into Libya today and yesterday. There's a narrative that now says that Libya needs a strong man to lead it, to create stability, and to bring stability once back to that country, and that many external players would possibly see Haftar fulfilling that role. What do you make of that narrative, Matteo?
Well, Waqar, I mean, yes. What I make of this narrative is basically showing the beautifully put hypocritical stance of those countries that they have decided to basically intervene in 2011. From the beginning, there was no understanding of the fact that this was not a one-way uprising, but it was a civil war, because Gaddafi maintained support in the country. So you had a strong man then, and they intervened from humanitarian reason to remove him, and now we need a strong man again. But what's changing this time is that he's willing to do deals with us. So I think that's basically, what we're witnessing. Now, on the ground, the situation is a bit different, obviously. In the sense that, yes, General Haftar does have support. We need to recognize this as well. We need to understand why he does have support. There is a lot of people, and by working extensively on Libya, I realized that the figure of one man and the figure of, the so-called Abuna, the father, the figure of the father ruling the country is still very much present.
Yeah.
And, so in that sense, it does have support, and there is also a lot of people who are backing up the army as an institution. What, anyway, we make of the international community simply is that the oil and the interest that there are in Libya are too high to not to be let it go in this way.
Just because we're running out of time, Matteo, I'm going to interrupt you. I do apologize, but I wanted to get Issam the final word. Issam, do you think Libya needs a strong man, or do Libyans deserve a democratically elected government? But can Haftar bring in stability for Libyans?
I think yes. Maybe we can say Libya need both. Libya need a power man, and also Libya need to install a political process, dialogue process, and to restore it again. Maybe to return back to Escalates agreement, which was a very good achievement. And to modify this agreement I think in consensus with all the parties, the parties in land, and also with intervention and conciliation with regional and international community and the patronage of UN. I think if, first of all, the first objective now is to make an end to the war, and then to move to another stage. The other stage is to restore a constitutional system, which is not new. We can modify, we can make an effort, but finishing with the lasting war is not in the benefit of the Libyan people.
Okay. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate both of your times, your insight, and of course analysis. That was Dr Issam Laaroussi, Professor of International Law, Senior Research Fellow at Trends for Research and Advisor. He was speaking to us from Abu Dhabi. We were also joined by Dr Matteo Capasso, who is Research Associate at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and is Associate Editor of Middle East Critique. And they were both speaking to us there on this very important topic, viewers, about what's happening there in Libya, because it certainly has a lot of external players, doesn't it, with their hands in this Libyan pie, with each of them having their own national interests. The biggest, of course, and most obvious is Libya's large oil reserves. And then there is General Khalifa Haftar, a strong man, or at least a self-appointed strong man, who is marching on the Libyan capital, Tripoli, bombing its abandoned airport and trying to take over the one that is now currently operating, Mitiga Airport, that is, in Tripoli. We'll keep a very close eye on how that situation there develops in Libya, because this has implications not just for Africa, but most importantly for Europe as well, as many asylum seekers use Libya as a point to then depart for Europe. We'll keep a close eye on that, as I said, here in Scope, but that's all for this show. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi.